Today we will be looking at 3 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. All 3 of them are heartbreaking and have one thing in common: how assumptions and abandonment in the depths of the earth can lead to disturbing tragic ends. As always, viewer discretion is advised. June 20th, 2015. It begins like many adventures do, with curiosity and a sense of wonder. But for Seth Rowe, what started as an exploration of nature's beauty soon spiraled into a life-or-death struggle, deep beneath the forest floor of Singhampton, Ontario. Seth Rowe, a 30-year-old outdoor enthusiast, had ventured into the conservation park with little more than a backpack, a headlamp, and an appetite for discovery. Seth had a secret plan: to explore the park's hidden crevice caves, a labyrinth of narrow passages carved by time and nature. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. This particular cave was unmarked and unnamed, a fissure barely wide enough for a human body. Seth's plan was straightforward: a quick look and back out. The entrance he found was barely visible, a narrow slit in the rocky ground, no more than 20 inches wide. It dropped steeply into the earth, narrowing further as it descended. Seth assessed the space. Confident in his ability, he switched on his headlamp and began to lower himself inside. In the world of caving, the temptation to push just a little farther is almost irresistible. But caves hold secrets and dangers that can quickly turn fascination into peril. The walls closed around him quickly, pressing on his shoulders as he moved deeper. At its narrowest, the passage was just 15 inches wide, forcing Seth to shift carefully with each step. He reached a point where the cave tightened further, leaving no room to continue. Suddenly, his progress halted. A section of rock jutted out just above him, blocking his path forward. Deciding it wasn't worth the risk to press on, Seth began to backtrack. But the cave had other plans. Bracing his foot against a small outcrop, Seth tried to hoist himself back toward the surface. The stone, worn by centuries of erosion, shifted under his weight. Before he could react, it crumbled away. He dropped like a stone. Seth plunged 36 feet into the darkness. The fall was sharp and disorienting, his body colliding with the jagged walls before coming to an abrupt stop. He was wedged in a narrow space, 18 feet from the entrance but far below the surface. Seth was alive, but his situation was grim. His arms and legs were scraped and bruised, and a shallow cut on his forehead bled steadily. He tried to move, but the crevice held him tightly. The pain was manageable, but the realization of his predicament was not. Alone, with no way to climb out, Seth began calling for help. The pain hit him in waves. His arms and legs throbbed with sharp, stinging sensations. The hours crawled by. Seth's cries for help echoed through the cave, swallowed by the earth above. He shouted until his throat burned, his voice fading into the suffocating silence. By evening, he began to lose hope. Alone in the dark, Seth felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The thrill of exploration had turned into a waking nightmare. Hours passed. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest above grew cold and still. Then, a sound broke through the stillness, a distant rustling, faint but unmistakable. Above ground, 2 hikers were making their way back to the trailhead when they heard the faintest cries for help, a faint, desperate voice. They stopped, listening carefully, and followed the sound to the cave's entrance. Peering into the opening, they spotted a faint glow far below. Seth's voice reached them, weak but clear. He was trapped and couldn't move. The hikers immediately called emergency services. Rescue teams arrived quickly. Floodlights illuminated the area as first responders assessed the situation. Seth was wedged too far down for a simple extraction, and the narrow passage made accessing him a challenge. Rescuers lowered water, granola bars, and blankets to keep him hydrated and warm while they worked. Despite his exhaustion, Seth remained alert, clinging to their reassurances. The team faced a significant obstacle: the cave's width. Standard rescue techniques were impossible. As midnight approached, they brought in an air chisel to carve away the rock around Seth. The work was painstakingly slow, each strike of the chisel reverberating through the crevice. By dawn, Seth had been underground for nearly 20 hours. Rescuers continued chipping away at the rock, widening the space around him inch by inch. The cold and exhaustion were taking their toll on everyone involved, but the team pressed on. Finally, after 22 hours of effort, Seth was freed. He emerged pale and battered, but alive. Rescuers wrapped him in blankets and rushed him to an ambulance. Remarkably, his injuries were minor. cuts, bruises, and dehydration. The operation was a success, but it came at a cost. The rescue effort had cost more than $46,000, sparking discussions about the financial burden of such incidents. Seth, however, was left with a deeper understanding of the risks he had taken. He later admitted that entering the cave alone was a mistake. His experience became a cautionary tale for others drawn to the thrill of unexplored places. The cave remains as it was, a narrow, unforgiving fissure, silent once again. Seth's story stands as a stark reminder of the dangers that lie beneath the surface, where even the smallest mistake can become a fight for survival. This next story is far more disturbing than the previous one. The horrific end will leave you asking questions. On 10th January 2010, two friends were tested by the unforgiving nature of nature itself. Upper Milerton Lake Cave, a network of winding passages, narrow drops, and freezing waters. For Paul Martson, 55, and Eric Burke, 36, it was just another day exploring the rugged underworld. Equipped with wetsuits and years of experience, the two ventured deep into the cave system, navigating precarious rock formations and frigid streams. But no amount of preparation could anticipate the chain of events that would leave one of them trapped, helpless, and on the brink of disaster. The pair had spent about an hour chimneying through the cave's tighter passages, occasionally dipping into icy water. Their plan was simple: explore and then return to the entrance. But in caves, simplicity is a luxury. They navigated a series of ledges and water-filled passages, their wetsuits offering some protection from the cold, but little comfort in the damp, claustrophobic environment. Their route took them further than most had ventured, a section where the passage narrowed, and debris from previous rockfalls cluttered the floor. Ahead of them, the sound of trickling water drew Paul's attention. He moved toward it, spotting a small hole where the water appeared to collect. It was tight, but passable. Below, he could see a vertical drop into the darkness, a tight, 6-foot vertical drop, just wide enough for a person to slither through. Paul decided to descend for a quick look before heading back. "I'll take a look and head back," Paul said over his shoulder. He slid into the hole feet first, using his hands to steady himself. His legs dangled freely as he searched for footholds. There were none. A chalk stone was wedged in the rock above the hole that could be used for support. Instinctively, he reached out to steady himself, grabbing the chalk stone. As he shifted his weight, the rock moved. In an instant, it came loose, and then it fell, slamming into his right arm and pinning it against the side of the hole. The impact left his torso halfway through the opening, his legs dangling over an unseen drop below. The stone crashed downward, pinning Paul's right arm between itself and a larger boulder at the hole's edge. His torso was still wedged in the narrow shaft, with his legs dangling freely below. His left arm flailed in the empty space beneath him, grasping at nothing. Paul's voice cut through the silence. 15 feet above, Eric scrambled to reach his friend. The sight was grim. Paul's arm was crushed, his body awkwardly contorted in the narrow space. If the rock shifted further, Paul's weight could pull him down, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Eric firmly told him not to move. He examined the rock, testing its stability. But even the slightest shift sent fresh pain through Paul's arm. Paul remained composed, his voice steady despite the rising panic. The calm belied the reality. Without outside help, Paul had no hope of freeing himself. And in the isolation of this remote cave, help wasn't coming. Eric assessed the situation. The chalk stone was too heavy to lift outright. Using smaller rocks as leverage, he chipped away at the edges, trying to reduce the weight pressing on Paul's arm. Eric decided to try shifting smaller rocks around the chalk stone to create space. With careful, deliberate movements, he chipped away at the debris, all while keeping an eye on the massive rock pinning Paul. Each adjustment brought a fresh wave of tension. Paul's voice broke through the silence. "If this rock goes, I'm done." "Hold steady," Eric replied. His focus remained absolute. Over time, Paul managed to gain a foothold in a small crack below. It was a minimal improvement, but enough to take some weight off his trapped arm. This gave Eric the opportunity to adjust his position and focus on the chalk stone itself. "I'm going to move it. When I do, pull yourself up," Eric instructed. Paul nodded, though the strain in his voice betrayed his fear. Eric braced himself, his feet wedged against the walls of the narrow passage. He grabbed the chalk stone with both hands and pushed. The rock shifted slightly and Paul began to pull himself upward. Suddenly, the stone slipped. Without thinking, Eric lunged forward, grabbing Paul by the back of his wetsuit just as the rock gave way. The force nearly pulled Eric into the hole, but he planted his legs against the walls and held firm. The chockstone crashed into the darkness below, its sound reverberating through the cave. Eric strained against Paul's weight, his muscles trembling as he hauled him upward. Finally, with one last desperate pull, Paul's torso cleared the edge. He collapsed onto the narrow ledge, his chest heaving. Eric fell back, gasping for air. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of dripping water was the only noise in the chamber. There was no time to celebrate. The danger wasn't over. Paul's arm was swollen and bruised, barely functional. Paul's strength was waning, and his swollen arm made climbing difficult. Eric took the lead, guiding Paul through the narrow passages. At one particularly tricky section, Paul faltered, his strength waning. Eric climbed above him, bracing himself on a ledge to offer a hand. The trek back to the cave's entrance felt endless. When they finally emerged into the fading light of dusk, the relief was overwhelming. They were alive, but the experience had left them shaken. In the unforgiving environment of Upper Milerton Lake Cave, survival often comes down to a mixture of skill, determination, and luck. On this day, all three were tested, and just barely enough. This third story follows a series of events that we have never covered before. On February 22, 1975, the skies above Bloomington, Indiana, were heavy with rain. The downpour had persisted for days, saturating the land and swelling rivers and streams across the region. During this, 3 university freshmen, Kim Aldrich, Marcia Bott, and Terry Yoakum, ventured into Salamander Cave, an underground labyrinth popular with novice cavers. For Aldrich, who had some caving experience, it seemed like an exciting way to spend the afternoon. For Bott and Yoakum, it was their first real taste of exploration. None of them carried adequate gear for the conditions they would soon face. Their journey began shortly after 1 p.m., but the rain-soaked cave would turn this outing into a deadly ordeal. Salamander Cave's charm lay in its accessibility, a feature that often lulled visitors into a false sense of security. However, heavy rains had transformed it into a potential death trap. The usually calm stream that wound its way through the cave was now a surging torrent. The group, undeterred by the rain, entered with only basic equipment: hard hats with carbide lamps for Aldrich and Yoakum, and a simple flashlight for Bott. They had no ropes, no waterproof gear, and no knowledge of how quickly a cave could flood under such conditions. As they stepped into the cave, they were met by John Abney, an experienced caver leading his group out. Abney had already seen the water levels rising dangerously and urged the students to turn back. His warning was clear: the cave was unsafe. Yet the 3 freshmen dismissed his advice, confident they could handle whatever lay ahead. Not long after, another warning came from Kathy Rowee, a graduate student conducting research in Salamander Cave. She had entered earlier in the day to study aquatic life, but had decided to leave when water levels reached her boots. Rowee not only left, but warned another group at the entrance who wisely chose to abandon their plans. Despite multiple warnings from experienced cavers, Aldrich, Bott, and Yoakum pressed on, eager to explore. Their decision to continue was rooted in inexperience and overconfidence. Aldrich, the group's leader, had explored caves before, but was far from an expert. Neither Bott nor Yoakum had any real caving experience, and none of them were prepared for the rapidly changing environment within Salamander Cave. As the trio moved deeper into the cave, the rain outside intensified. The cave's passages, once dry and navigable, began filling with water at an alarming rate. The stream inside, now a raging torrent, transformed familiar paths into a maze of danger. What might have seemed like manageable terrain during their initial descent became increasingly hostile. By 8:15 p.m., the situation outside had grown dire. Family and friends became more concerned and contacted people about their whereabouts. In some time, it was apparent that they were trapped inside the cave. With urgency, they reached out to the authorities for help. Michael Moore and Jim Keith, experienced cavers called by Indiana State Police, arrived to assess the cave's condition. What they found was sobering. Only 18 inches of airspace remained at the entrance passage. The water was rising steadily, leaving little hope for anyone trapped inside. The rescue team understood the urgency, but faced enormous challenges navigating the submerged tunnels. Inside the cave, the signs of the students' struggle became apparent. Muddy footprints marked their desperate attempts to find higher ground. Scratches on the cave walls suggested they had clung to the slick surfaces, fighting against the rising floodwaters. A carbide lamp lay abandoned, its light barely flickering. Even a half-eaten snack left on a ledge hinted at a fleeting moment of rest, where the trio may have tried to regroup before pressing on. The next morning, rescue efforts resumed. The water had receded slightly, allowing searchers to enter the cave. Less than 100 feet from the entrance, they found the bodies of Kim Aldrich and Marcia Bott. Both had drowned, overwhelmed by the surging floodwaters. Their bodies lay in the narrow entrance passage, where the airspace had all but disappeared. Terry Yoakum was still missing, and rescuers hoped he had managed to find shelter in a higher chamber. About 500 feet from the entrance was Breakdown Mountain, a massive 30-foot-high passage known as a potential refuge during floods. If Yoakum had made it past the narrow, water-filled passages leading to this area, he might have survived. However, their hopes were dashed. Yoakum's body was discovered not far from his friends, suggesting he too had been unable to escape the relentless rise of the floodwaters. Evidence indicated that the group had likely tried to press on, but had been overtaken by the water in one of the cave's tighter sections. In some places, only an inch of airspace remained, far too little for survival. Post-mortem analysis revealed that a combination of factors led to the disaster. The students lacked the equipment and training necessary for caving in such dangerous conditions. They ignored multiple warnings from experienced individuals, and, as the water levels rose, panic likely overtook them. Instead of retreating to higher ground within the cave, they attempted to escape through the increasingly treacherous entrance passage, a decision that proved fatal